So first of all, I just want to say I'm really just grateful to be here. I grew up in Greenwich Village in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan wasn't our hero in my neighborhood at that point in time. Spent 10 years in Democratic administrations. And just to know that the Reagan Foundation is so committed to DEI that they would include me is just a really comforting thought. I've also never seen this many people at 7 a.m. But to answer your question, Kyla, in terms of something like immigration, we're at a share of immigrants in our country that is the highest it's been for 120 years, when there was a lot of backlash to immigration. So in some sense, the populist era 120 years ago, which was not primarily about immigration, it was in part about actually the lack of inflation, because people were debtors, they owed money and they wanted more inflation, but it was about money, it was about inflation, it was about those sets of issues, about immigration. Trade was growing quite rapidly 120 years ago as well. The difference is now the set of tools the federal government has are just much, much more extensive than they were 120 years ago. And the redefinition of the magnitude of those tools that can be wielded by the president without Congress is being contested, reshaped, and is still, in our courts an open question right now. But we're dealing with, issues of that magnitude and that type of realignment that we had back then.
So I won't go that far back, but it does feel like, to me, the late 60s, early 70s, where the country sort of was uncertain about its future, didn't feel that it had a vision of how to go forward, very defensive international posture, both from a security point of view, but also economically. OPEC was out to get us, we didn't know what to do. Went off the dollar, went off the gold standard, didn't know how to handle all those things. And so there was, and the policymaking was not crystallized by a vision into which you could then put the nuts and bolts of policy. It was just lots of little pulling at the levers and hoping something worked. And it was a time of very bad economic performance. A lot of inflation, a lot of unemployment. We resorted to wage and price controls. We did all sorts of horrible things. And this feels like that, and we need to move forward.
And when we think about innovation, oftentimes the private and public sector would work together. So if you're thinking about something like DARPA, the government would seed and then private capital would scale. And it feels like there's an increasing disconnect between the private and public sector. So could you just talk to that, kind of the fraying of relationship, or if you think the relationship is strong? Jason?
I'm trying to think Kyla, if I agree with the premise of your question. I mean, the Biden administration did rhetorically even more, but in substance quite a lot of industrial policy. And that very much was the government, for better or worse, getting very involved with the private sector, whether that was directing activities through grants, through tax credits, and the like. I think you could interpret tariffs, possibly charitably, as an attempt to do that as well. Certainly the sectoral tariffs are the government getting involved in sectors, whether that's the auto sector at some point coming forward, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors.
Movies.
And movies, the movie industry, all important for national security. And so, if anything, there's a thing called neoliberalism. I don't totally love the term, but it's evidently continuity from Reagan through Clinton, possibly as far as Obama. And that I think was a bit skeptical of the government being involved in industries. And I think there was that skepticism running through those presidencies. But for the last 8 or 9 years, I think that skepticism has been out the window.
I think it's even more dramatic than that. I mean, we've talked about
what's more dramatic than out the window?
It's both the, I think, Democrats, your fault, and now it's all your fault, but we'll go on to that. No, but now the right wing of the Republican Party have lost any faith in the capacity of the private sector to deliver a good life to Americans, and there's this deep belief you must use the power of the state to obtain the objectives. Big use of it on the left under Obama, and now you're seeing it with the Trump administration. And that to me is one of the most disappointing things about this era, is that there's no belief in the private enterprise, the capacity to deliver economic growth, productivity growth, higher real wages. All good things must come from the government. And that's how the problems are framed. And because they're framed that way, we get bad answers.
And how do you think we can reframe it if that's necessary?
Well, I think once it doesn't work, people will be happy to reframe. I think we're in the middle of that, to be honest, but it hasn't played out entirely.
You think so?
Yeah.
Yeah, what makes you think that we're in the middle of something like that?
Because there's no coherence in either party, right? They haven't, this is not a vision so compelling with a proof of a concept that everyone's willing to sign on either side. So both parties are struggling to figure out who they are and what they believe in. I think that's characteristic of these transition points.
Yeah. And there's, we were talking about this in the green room, sort of this balance between good politics, good policy, and good economics. And sometimes all three of those don't really align. And so it's sometimes difficult to...
Really?
Yeah. Sometimes difficult to convince the public of a certain type of policy that might be necessary. And so what do you all see as the sharpest tension between what policymakers are trying to do versus what they should be doing right now?
I mean, trade is the place where there's probably the biggest disconnect between the set of things that economists know and understand related to concepts like comparative advantage, like trade deficits aren't a measure of a country being taken advantage of and aren't some type of loss or negative you want to get rid of, and a set of public perceptions around trade. Within trade, I think something that economists need to be better at, and I might even include myself in that, is distinguishing what is big and important and really matters from what are smaller symbolic things that help either address real issues or keep the public on side. So when I think of 10% tariffs on every country in the world, that is, to me, relatively big and consequential. Don't think it solves some public purpose, and in fact, I think it will result in higher prices that will not keep the public on side. When you think of China, first of all, there's a set of legitimate issues around national security where it's worth paying a price in order to accomplish your national security objective. I wouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that protecting ourselves from China will make us richer, it'll make us poorer, but it might make us safer, and that might be a trade that is worth it. But second of all, there's certain things that are symbolic and smaller and might actually matter and see people fighting for jobs. And so what the Biden administration did more Buy American than previous administrations had. I personally didn't like it. I personally was critical of it. Do I think if you did a cost-benefit test of the political benefits of it relative to the economic costs, it might have passed? It might well have passed, because I don't think the economic costs were that large. That being said, I like to whine even about small economic costs.
I think that the big disconnect is the obsession of both the past two administrations on manufacturing, and this sort of fairy tale that is told about the demise of American manufacturing, as if somehow this was taken from us by evil foreigners, and so that's the thing we have to fix. 90% of Americans don't work in manufacturing, and it would be a good idea for an administration to care about them and have policies that broadly improve the welfare. And periodically, the policymakers wake up and say, "Oh wait, tech, not manufacturing, tech," but there's not an appreciation of the need to have a set of policies that allow all the sectors to flourish on their own terms, and that was always the formulation, which is to keep the government out and let that happen. And that's missing right now.
Do you think part of the reason that the U.S. has been so focused on manufacturing is because it doesn't really know what its future is? So it's much easier to return to the past than try to move forward.
I mean, manufacturing job loss does have a quality that other job loss doesn't have to nearly the same degree, which is it's highly concentrated. That can make its consequences worse than job loss in other areas, because it's not like one restaurant goes out of business, you go work at another restaurant. It's sort of the whole industry in that area. So there is somewhat more concentrated pain associated with manufacturing. Now, interestingly, that might imply that we actually want less of it. That that's not a great thing to employ lots of people in, because it's actually in some ways a quite risky industry for the consequences it has for people in the way that others aren't. I think part of the manufacturing thing is a fetishism. I mean, I once testified to Congress, and a member of Congress was basically trying to argue to me that you shouldn't count services as part of GDP because, like, they didn't weigh anything. And I'm just sort of like, I don't know, do you go to restaurants? Do you go on vacation? Do you get health care? Do your kids get education? Are those things you like? Maybe if they're things you like and are valuable, they should show up in GDP. And it was sort of like, no, I want the stuff that weighs stuff to be what is in GDP. So part of it is that. Part of it obviously is the political system that magnifies the power of certain states. And I think that'll be interesting for the Democrats. In some sense, they're thinking right now, we just gave tens of billions of dollars to various pension funds in 2021. Those unions didn't endorse us. Maybe we don't want to do payoffs for unions and try to go through the Rust Belt states. Instead, appeal to places like Arizona and Florida. And by the way, you don't appeal to them with manufacturing. So there might be some changes, as some people rethinking all of that, but it's a combination of both reality and political mythology.
I'll stick with that.
He said everything perfectly. That's good to hear. So I grew up in Kentucky, and there is a lot of trouble in the middle of America. Now the Wall Street Journal had a great article talking about the college towns that are disappearing. And of course, it's a very important area for the government, for politics. So what do you think we can, what should middle America be focusing on as we think about potentially shifting away from manufacturing? How can we think about reviving the middle of the country?
So first of all, I don't buy the premise that it's the middle of the country. If you actually look at the state-by-state data and group it into census regions and look at decline in manufacturing as a share of output, manufacturing as a share of employment, the middle of America didn't do worse than everyone else. That's just how it's been framed. So that's sort of point number one. I think grounding this in the facts would be a healthy step forward. Number two, the fundamental problem everywhere you find one of these areas that just cannot revive itself is education and skills, period. And the most distressing thing to me about where we are right now, the things we talk about on campaigns, the policies we worry about, is they do not address at all the absolute failure of the American K-12 education system and the fact that we are not equipping the next generation to compete in a competitive global economy. Period. It's just we measure it, we put out the test scores, we've watched them stagnate for a decade at levels where a quarter to a third of eighth graders are seriously deficient in math and reading, and doesn't come up in any of the policy discussions. And then we have the pandemic and it gets worse, and we're still not doing anything. And we're not going to solve problems like that until we decide to equip our citizens with the ability to solve problems.
A little bit more worried about some parts of the country than Doug is. I agree with your answer being part of it, and the rest of the answer I'm genuinely not sure. If you look at men between the age of 25 and 54, in the early 1960s, virtually all of them were in the labor force. Virtually all of them were employed. And it's fallen over time, and now it's more like 85% of them are employed. And if you look at that, it's just very, very concentrated. And it's very concentrated in a region that sort of roughly overlaps with Appalachia. And so there's a lot of places that really have been, and maybe it's not due to manufacturing. I'll look at those data, Doug. But there are areas that have genuinely been hollowed out that have very serious employment problems. Now, what I do know is that people-based policies are great. And so doing more things for people, things like education, things like incentives to work and the like, are unambiguously a good thing. What's more of a question is, are there policies for places? What politicians really want is something to help that place revive itself. And economists have always been very skeptical of that. We think they don't work. We think to the degree they do anything, they benefit the landowners in that area, not the people in that area, that they end up getting distorted by the political system. I don't have a better answer, but I don't love not having an answer to the question. I also don't love the idea of mobility as the only answer, because mobility might hurt the place that people are leaving from. It might even hurt the place that people are showing up at, even if it helps the person doing the moving. So to me, that's an important open issue, is there something you can do at the level, of a place, not just at the level of people.
Interesting. And it seems like one of the big issues that I think everybody has been sort of circling around is trust in institutions, and getting people to trust that institutions have their best interests at heart, or at least can help them. And so, as economists, how do you think that you can re-engage the public, considering this level of skepticism that they have towards policy and economists in general?
You're asking two economists about faith and trust.
Yeah.
We need more coffee.
I mean, I'm at Harvard University, and we're having a set of issues these days. You can be around people, and they can talk about, isn't it terrible? There's all these ignorant people out there, and they're listening to Joe Rogan, and they're ignoring vaccines, and they're taking horse medicine to solve their diseases, and et cetera, et cetera. And my response to that is there's two parts to this problem. One part is there's a set of people who really are listening to the wrong people, really are falling for misinformation, and that's a problem. The second part of the problem is that the people who are supposed to be trusted, like Harvard University, like the New York Times, like economists, all of our institutions have failed in lots of ways. We have, done things, in the list that people have of things like the lab leak theory, the COVID masks, which at first didn't help prevent COVID unless you were a health worker. Then they were absolutely necessary. The, way in which, like the Hunter Biden laptop, all these different things. But I have a list like that in economics too, where I think economists have had, a thumb on the scale for certain things. Have, on immigration, you'll read economists who say like immigration hasn't really gone up, and it's gone way, way up, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but just people can see some set of facts in front of them, and if you deny it. So anyway, I think part of the problem is that elites basically haven't been telling the truth to people to the best of their ability. Part of the problem is that people fall for all sorts of, dumb stuff. And if you're in the elite, you can do more to patrol yourself and do a better job of re-earning trust than just lecturing people for being ignorant and listening to Joe Rogan. So I do think making an extra effort to do a better job yourself and patrol your own side is at least part of the answer to this problem.
So I like where that ended, and I just want to point out this didn't happen overnight. I think it's too infrequently we just reflect on the larger picture. What happened was, first of all, we get September 11th, 2001, and the American public concludes that the national security people can't keep them safe. Like they said that we were going to be safe. We're not safe at all. They took the towers down. And then we collectively told them markets work, and we got the financial crisis and the Great Recession, another huge national trauma in a relatively short period. And then, they conclude economists, forget it. They don't know. They told us this is all good, and we can rely on markets, and we can't. And then we get the pandemic, where we do graciously a horrible job of public education, masks and other things being examples of that. And the public concludes one more time, like, okay, this public health establishment we don't trust them. They can't even tell us the truth about what happened, and we have this huge trauma. So we do have an American citizenry who have been through three enormous traumas in a very short period of time. And they are fearful and distrusting, and I think we earned their distrust over that period. And I think Jason's right about doing the extra work to patrol your own side. Don't let people say things that are literally not true just for the purposes of courting favor and delivering results. These were all really bad outcomes. The outcomes matter. We have to deliver better results.
Yeah.
Can I say something about that I think was quite important, relating to what we were talking about earlier? Is that all this discussion of why the rise of populism, why the decline in trust, and there's one model which is basically that this was because of secular trends. Inequality went up, manufacturing went down, that gave rise to populism. There's another that it's a series of discrete, specific events. 9/11, financial crisis, COVID, I would include, and I'm sure you'd be happy to have it as a friendly amendment, the burst of inflation in your list of traumas. I think that second set of explanations to me is much more compelling than the first set. Part of why they're much more compelling than the first set is Ronald Reagan. Manufacturing jobs were massively declining before 1980. Mm-hmm. And so if you think populism is that you're losing manufacturing jobs, Ronald Reagan would have been a populist, and he very much was popular, but wasn't populist in the sense that we're talking about right now. So many of these trends, the rise in inequality, it rose more from 1975 to 2000, but the burst of populism wasn't until 15 years after that. So I do think it's these specific events that have changed our politics much more than these long-running trends. And that's important because that diagnosis of the problem does feed into the way people think about what does and doesn't work for the solution. And the diagnosis is one, this leads you to is sort of don't really screw things up and don't have bad luck happen to you. And the second one's a little harder to operationalize.
And when you think about the institutional architecture, right, so the various entities that are executing on, maybe a failed pandemic program or various policies that they're trying to put forth, do you think that there's a necessity for new tools and new institutions to address some of these trust concerns that people have? Or do you think the existing institutions are capable of managing it?
That's a really hard question.
It's a very hard question.
If we could just keep the institutions we have, like the Federal Reserve, I'd be pretty happy. So most of the ideas for institutional change I see are worse, not better. And in that sense, I am a small c conservative, that I'd rather sort of tinker and make sure we are moving in the right direction rather than take a big leap into something new and hope it's better, but end up being like Joseph Stalin.
So there's a flavor of that question which I really disagree with, which is the idea that we erect better institutions and they will from the top down produce better outcomes for people and the people will be happier. We have the institution that we need. It's representative democracy and it delivers what the people want. We might not on this stage not like what the majority of people want right now, but it does work, and I get very nervous when people want to bypass the electoral process, bypass the democratic right for people to choose who represents them in Congress, even if I don't like their choices. And so, I've never been a big fan of we'll have a commission to do this because we can't trust Congress to do it. That never works. You can't bypass getting the people to support good outcomes, good policy. I have basically felt that I have dedicated my adult life to the notion that good policy should be good politics. And that's just really hard, and I've never accomplished anything. But you have to do that. You have to do it that way.
I do think there's you can say the people, but then the question is who decides what the people think. And that's a big issue right now with independent agencies. For example, is it the president decides what the people think and tells the agencies what to do? Do the agencies have some of their own independent thing? Is it Congress that ultimately has to make these decisions and has to legislate on everything rather than have the regulatory agencies? So even within the existing set of institutions, that whole set of questions is very much in flux. And some of them, other than the independence of the Fed, some of the other ones I'm actually less sure that I know the answer to.
Yeah. And this will be the final question for this panel, and it's another kind of hard one, but what do you think the most under-discussed risk is right now? So we have it feels like every time we open our phones, there's a new headline about something. So what do you think is one of the biggest risks that we're facing that we might not be considering very closely, or you don't think that we are?
Well, the one I would have said we weren't paying attention to until very recently was the federal budget and the fiscal outlook, which I believe has been harming this country's ability to progress for 2 decades. In the 20th century, in 60 to 2000, whatever you might have thought of the year to year, on average, deficits were 2% of GDP, 2.2%. We ended the 20th century with a balanced budget. There was relatively tight fiscal policy, and there was better trend economic growth. The 21st century, we've averaged over 5. The debt has only gone up relative to GDP. No one has cared. In the 20th century, when you had a big emergency, the debt went up, but then it went back down. We don't clean up in the 21st century; it just goes up. And we've had poor, 1 percentage point, poor trend economic growth, and I don't think those are unrelated. And I think people were not appreciating on a year-to-year basis what we were giving up in the way of the capacity to raise the standard of living by just not doing our job at the federal level.
So let me, for the record, say I agree with Doug, although if you're at a 9 out of 10, I might be at more of a 6 out of 10, and I think part of the problem is that it chips away at your growth year after year, as opposed to we're going to wake up and our lives are dramatically transformed because of it. And in part, that's why we have the rising debt that we have, because if it just chips away in some way, you don't end up noticing it. Yeah. It's not like it's an under-discussed or out of left field idea, but if China invaded Taiwan, the consequences of that would be high up on the pantheon of events of the last quarter century that we discussed before, in terms of the magnitude of economic dislocation, the magnitude of geopolitical dislocation, and fallout for decades to come. And so you don't wake up thinking about it every single day because it's not in the headlines every single day, but that looming in the background is just utterly terrifying to me.
Okay, well, a great way to end the panel.
Can we say that AI, though, is terrific and it's going to save us from all these problems, maybe even the debt?
That would be amazing. Well, thank you so much, everybody, and thank you so much, Jason and Doug, for everything that you've done and for sharing your time and your knowledge on stage today. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.